If you have a Bible and you like following along, please turn in it to 2 Kings chapter 2. He's all right. This is what children do. They have to be children, unfortunately. I mean, it's just the way it is. So 2 Kings chapter 2, this is where we'll spend our time. And I want to put before us this morning the question as to what are we doing as followers of Jesus? What are we working for? What things do we see as important? And I'm going to enumerate some of those things, but something got mentioned at Sunday school that I thought was pretty important. At least it's important to me to think about, and that is this. If you take a thimble and you fill it with some tap water and you take it out and dump it into the ocean, that's kind of like what it is for you and me to be followers of Jesus and to do whatever it is we do in service to God. And Jesus came and went nearly 2,000 years ago. There have been a lot of Christians since that. And there are 2.75 billion of us on the planet right now today. All of us hopefully accomplishing something to further God's kingdom. So each one of our inputs into that huge expanse of work looks very much like a thimble going into the ocean. So right now, I don't know if you're aware of this or not, but there are people who were born since 1997 whom we term Gen Z. Now, I have to see charts to figure this out. Who's a millennial? Who's a boomer? Who's a what? But anyway, Gen Z, they're very much in the workforce now as those who've been born, say, in 1997 and a few years after. And they're finding themselves very frustrated in that they don't feel like they're having any impact in the world. They go to work, and after a couple of months, they figure they should be having some tremendous impact for the world, and they don't, and they become frustrated by it. Well, you and I, here we are as followers of Jesus. We may give money, we may do some service work, we may speak to someone, but think about the input, how small that is compared to the work that's there to be done. So with that in mind, let's look at 2 Kings chapter 2. I'll begin reading in verse 1. Just before the Lord took Elijah up to heaven in a windstorm, Elijah and Elisha were traveling from Gilgal. Elijah told Elisha, "Stay here, for the Lord has sent me to Bethel." But Elisha said, "As certainly as the Lord lives and as you live, I will not leave you." So they both went to Bethel. Some members of the prophetic guild in Bethel came out to Elisha and said, "Do you know that today the Lord is going to take your master from you?" And Elisha answered, "Yes, I know, but keep it to yourself." Elijah said to him, "Elisha, stay here, for the Lord is sending me to Jericho." But Elisha said, "As certainly as the Lord lives and you live, I will not leave you." And so they both went to Jericho. Some members of the prophetic guild approached Elisha and said to him again, "Do you know that the Lord is going to take your master from you today?" Elisha answered, "Yes, I know, but keep quiet." Elijah said to him, "Stay here, for the Lord has sent me to the Jordan." But Elisha again said, "As certainly as the Lord lives and you live, I will not leave you." And so they traveled on together. 50 members of the prophetic guild went out and stood opposite them at a distance, while Elijah and Elisha stood by the Jordan River. Elijah took his cloak and folded it up and hit the water with it, and the water divided, and the two of them crossed over on dry ground. When they had crossed over, Elijah said to Elisha, "What can I do for you before I'm taken away from you?" Elisha answered Elijah and said, "May I receive a double portion of the prophetic spirit which energizes you?" Elijah replied, "That's a very difficult request, but if you see me taken from you, it may be so. But if you don't, it will not happen." As they were walking along and talking, suddenly a fiery chariot pulled by fiery horses appeared between them, and Elijah went up to heaven in a windstorm. While Elisha was watching, he cried out, my father, the chariot and the horsemen of Israel," which is probably what you'd do if you saw something like that. Then he could no longer see Elijah. He grabbed his clothes and tore them in two. He picked up Elijah's cloak, which had fallen off of Elijah, and went back and stood by the river Jordan. He took the cloak that had fallen off Elijah and hit the water with it and said, "Where is the Lord, the God of Elijah?" When Elisha hit the water, it divided, and Elisha crossed over on dry ground. When the members of the prophetic guild in Jericho, who were standing at a distance, saw him do this, they said, "The spirit that energizes Elijah rests upon Elisha." And they went and met him and bowed down to the ground before him. One of those stories that is in the text that I find amazing that I actually believe, and I do, that Elijah would do these things in a fiery chariot and all the rest of it. But there's a message in it for us, I think, especially where we are as a church. And so as I was thinking about this, let's think about the things that we're all attempting to do. I hope we are, in some measure, attempting to do these things, whether it be unseen, it doesn't make any difference. We are all working in some of these venues of service to God. For instance, we're doing small things, we're doing big things, lots of things in between, wherein we're serving the Lord or attempting to. We're hopefully attempting in some small way to steer others towards salvation, are we not? We're hopefully attempting to reflect God's nature to this fallen world, to the people we're close to. We're hopefully attempting to show the world that our lives are changed in some way, that we're different people. And within all of these things that we're attempting to do, we're, of course, mindful of the fact that we can easily be ensnared along the way, and that sin can ensnare us and trap us out as we attempt to do these things, and somehow we find ourselves then perhaps taken off the rails just a little bit in terms of what God is asking us to do. You know, sin can be chronic. It can be something, and I think all of us, if we thought about it very long, we could think of something that we have in our lives that pulls at us all the time, whether it be attitudinal or whatever it is. But, you know, God has given us the ability to be self-determined here in this universe. So even though sin may come to us in a way that pulls at us, we can still choose. All of us can choose in every moment what we're going to do or not do. Think about it like this. Let's say, for instance, that you're standing in a 25-story building and you're looking out the window. The window's open. It's a nice spring day. The wind's pouring in. It's beautiful outside. You can see across the city skyline to some degree. If you choose to jump out the window, you will go down to the ground. We all know this, right? I mean, there's nothing mysterious about this at all. But think about the power of that. Think about the fact that you and I walk through this world with the power of life and death in our hands all the time. You know, you pick up somebody Sawyer's size and carry them. You have the power of life and death with that child. We have the power of life and death over ourselves. Think about a doctor, right? Think about Aria, Sergio's daughter, who's being treated. That doctor has the power of life and death over that child. It's an incredible thing. And when we move and make choices, sometimes if we choose towards sin, there's an inexorable moral law that will take over, and those choices will cascade into all kinds of consequences. You and I, we know all this, but I'm describing it for a particular reason here. See, sin draws up next to us, and it happens this way for all of us, and it says to us, here, whatever that thing is, you will find freedom. It does. And you know what? That's actually true. It's true. I mean, I can make a choice to follow something that tempts me because I'm free to make that choice. That is freedom. However, the problem is that inexorable moral law that God has planted in the universe and planted in our hearts will come along, and pretty soon we'll find out that the freedom we expected in following the sin turns into slavery, which is always the case. There's a real choice. The freedom is real, but when we make the choice to follow sin, then we find ourselves trapped by it to some degree, ensnared and then enslaved. Paul says that very clearly. First 5 chapters of Romans, I would encourage everybody to absorb that literature, because in there you find that whatever we plant ourselves to be subject to, then we find out that we're enslaved to it. The beautiful thing is that God has us made in such a way, and he's put this moral law inside of us, that we can't shove the guilt out the door. I'm very thankful for that, personally. The fact that I cannot sin in comfort. There's something God is going to come along very shortly, usually after the sin takes place, and say, okay, you've just messed up. You've messed up. Jerry Clower said that so well. We always know when we're messing up. Well, what happens to us ultimately is, of course, that this sin does damage to us in some way. And I'm going to say the best we can find in it is that at the very best, our witness becomes sterilized by it to some degree. If we sin, if we practice sin, then for a period of time, whatever that period God initiates the process of repentance and everything else that has to go through, we're going to be kind of sterilized in our witness. I mean, I don't know how it is for you all, but I can tell you, I feel that there's a place where I realize I'm not useful to God in any way right now. I've got to get this straightened out. I've got to go to God and straighten it out. And think about this. You know, it's interesting to me. Within our culture, we've got all kinds of pressures that are telling us that over here is this wild freedom that we can all find and exercise and enjoy. You see it, for instance, in our show folk, the Hollywood crowd. It's amazing to me to see that it's not sufficient that you and I, as followers of Jesus, be merely tolerant of these things. That's not going to do. No, we have to actually come alongside and celebrate it. So what this tells me is that sin always will draw, if it draws us and we don't get straight with the Lord about it, whatever that is, it's going to draw others as well, even though we're not trying to do that necessarily. In other words, anything we do has an effect, not just on us, but on the people around us. If we activate an impetus to sin, it's going to affect all the people close to us, and then if we move in the wider world, it's going to affect them as well. I don't see that this is a flaw. I think this is a good thing, because now others around me become helpful to me in helping me to get out of whatever it is I'm doing or whatever it is I'm thinking. So sin is like that. It's not content to just allow you and me to enjoy it alone. No, it's got to help bring other people along so that the misery gets shared amongst everybody. You know, Satan is really busy. And he's not happy just for Rip to sin. He wants everybody else to come along for the ride. Think about it this way. I was reading this morning. I don't know why. I just thought it's interesting to me. I guess because maybe I looked at these notes. I don't know. But you remember Jim Jones in the 70s? Oh, no. You know, when he started out, when he was in Indiana, he was doing amazingly good things as a pastor of that church. He was actually started out with United Methodists. I don't know if you're aware of that. And he had all kinds of programs out of that little church where he was working to bring in racial equality. There was a lot of Indiana, and still to this day is a kind of a hotbed for lots of racial movements, white supremacist movements and things like that, or a lot of them are headquartered in Indiana. And he was in a town, and he was doing many good things to solve some of these problems. He was helping the poor. They had a soup kitchen. They were doing all kinds of good stuff. And then somehow he got tangled up in some way in his mind to such a degree that he came to the place where he started thinking himself to be above anything that would ever call him out, that he was accountable to anybody. As a matter of fact, toward the end there, he actually told his congregation that he was God incarnate. Now, I could, right away, you know, the bells go off for me. I just think, okay, something's wrong with you. But he started off good. And what happened to him was he started to indulge sin. And once he indulged it, and you got deeper and deeper and deeper into it, he became enslaved to it, and he took 930 people with him to Guyana. Sin is a lot stronger than we are, and the tempted usually become the tempted, the tempters over time. So sin, even in private, it'll poison us for sure, but it'll poison others as well. Now, of course, what is remarkable to me is that God puts up with us, and he does. He loves us so much. Think about it like this. David, when he sinned, when David committed the sin with Bathsheba, He knew he'd messed up. You know how I know that? Because he had Uriah killed to cover it up. He knew he was wrong. He knew it all along. There was no mystery for him that he had perhaps done something that was okay, even though he was king. No mystery whatsoever. So what did he do? He tried to do what we all do. He tried to shove the guilt away. If I can create a world around me where none of this matters, the guilt goes away and I can continue on. Of course, Nathan and God had a different plan in mind, and Nathan pointed the finger at him and said, "You're the man." And then David repented. Think of that. All of the fruits of the sin David got to enjoy. And it wasn't until God called him out that he repented. I'm thankful that that narrative is in the Bible. I really am. So we're not just passive recipients here. We're making choices all along the way. We could have stood in the window 25 floors up and just enjoyed the view. But once we jump out, the inexorable laws of the universe take over and the consequences flow. And on the way down, we might feel remorse, right? You hear people say, well, the devil made me do it. Well, there's some truth to that, but we're the ones making the choices. We're in command of our individual ships. Now, the only way this gets straightened out, of course, is that we become like the tax collector in Luke 18, where the Pharisees are saying, I'm thankful, God, that I'm not like this tax collector. And the tax collector's beating his chest and saying, have mercy on me, God, a sinner. When we come to that spot, God can begin to heal us. But once he heals us, there's stuff for us to do. And this is where I want to funnel all this down today. We begin to take on the work of discipleship. And the best example I know of this that I can think of is Esther. And this goes back to that thimble in the ocean. Think of your ministry or my ministry, whatever it is, the thimble in the ocean. Esther was raised up in a Jewish home and her parents died. And then Mordecai, her uncle, took over the raising of Esther. I wonder about this. This is where God's plan becomes very mysterious to me. I wonder if the death of her parents, I'm not saying God engineered it, but he surely used it. Because through Mordecai, Esther became Esther, the Esther we read about in the Bible. The Jews faced an existential threat from the Persians, that they were going to be exterminated, and Mordecai alerted Esther, and Esther stepped in the gap. Notice something about that scenario. I have so much admiration for Mordecai. He risked his daughter. Think how much harder it is to risk one of your children than it is to risk yourself. Right? If the bus is coming, I can run out in front of it myself and take the hit a whole lot easier than I could shove Jackson out in front of it. Edward Hale said this, 19th century pastor. I love this. He said this, I am one. Think about the thimble in the ocean, but I'm still one. I can't do everything, but I can do something. Because I can't do everything, I won't refuse to do the something I can do. That's a clue to how God wants to use us. Think about the sadness of the words that we utter. I've uttered them. Maybe you have too. It might have been. Esther didn't have to say it might have been. Esther made the choice. I remember reading about Bubba Smith, a football player from the 70s who I knew about when I used to watch football as a kid. And he wouldn't do a beer commercial. Now, does it really matter that one football player out of the 1,700 players won't do a beer commercial? I don't think so. But he said, I won't do it because if I do it, it'll compromise who I am before the Lord. God's purposes and his calling appear to all of us in time. And the history into which Esther was placed, God used her in that place. She was called out and she got used. We don't have the ability to look down the road and see what the outcome's going to be. Mordecai was completely uncertain as to how that was going to go. Esther was uncertain. When she walked into the throne room, the king could have just said, you weren't invited in here. That's it for you. And he would have been perfectly justified in Persia to have done that. We don't view God's communications often as we ought. I miss them. All of us miss them. For instance, if I come to a place where I feel prompted by God, I'm going to ask myself the question, am I being prompted by God? That's the first question that occurs to me. Is this God? Am I certain about that? No. Mordecai wasn't certain. He was just obedient. So here we are today. We've essentially come to the place where next door we've got this facility that we've essentially finished. I mean, there are a few things to be done there, but we had Sunday school in there this morning, had a big dinner there a few weeks back. Looks like we're going to have another one, which, by the way, we need to speak about before we leave today. But we finished that building with so few in this congregation. And, right, it is a miracle. And we don't know the outcome, do we? We don't know the outcome for this church at all. But we've been obedient. But we're thinking maybe there's a future here that doesn't have anything to do with us. Those who come behind us to continue this work. And this takes us all the way back to Elijah and Elisha. God was done with Elijah. And so Elijah passed on his work to Elisha, who would take it over. So in the same way, after you and I and all of us here are properly buried, however that happens, God's work is going to go on. And so what we've done in this building, what we've done in being here this whole time is we've taken our thimble and we've dumped it in the ocean. Did the ocean swell up because of our thimble? No, but you know what? If you take a thimble, and if the ocean was a static body of water, and you could dump the water into space, if you stayed there long enough, a thimble load would eventually empty the ocean. In other words, Paul says it well in 1 Corinthians 15. Do not fall short in doing good, because all of it matters in the sight of the Lord. So the small thimble load we bring here in this congregation to this kingdom work is a worthy thimble to be brought. It's worth doing. It was worth it, just like it's worth it for Elijah to hand over his work to Elisha. I don't know where everybody is today, but if I've said anything about which you've got a question, you want to pray with me, I'll stay as long.